My name is Moonpie, and today we are here to look at my critically effective Zealot build. So if you're looking to take your Zealot from 0 to hero, then sit down, buckle up, and get ready to become a critical component of your team. Now, as I'm sure you've already figured out, the main focus of the build is to be as killy as possible using crits, because if we're killing enemies, then they're not killing us. Before we take a look at the weapons, we'll first take a look at the talent tree and where you should generally be distributing your points. So firstly, on the right side here, we have an increase of 20% on backstab hits. Now, most enemies that we're going to be killing are going to be looking right at us, so this is not particularly useful, but for some enemies, like the big shield boys and some of the bigger enemies, it's not a bad thing to have. The next one is that when we apply a critical hit, it applies a stack of bleed. When we attack an enemy that has a stack of bleed on them, it increases our critical strike chance up to 30%. Now, most enemies we're going to be killing in 1 or 2 shots, so this is not particularly useful, but again, when we're attacking some of the bigger boys that take a few more shots to go down, this is definitely useful. The next one is an increase in the amount of toughness we're gaining from melee kills. With the number of enemies that we're going to be churning through, increasing the number of toughness that we actually gain from killing them is definitely a good thing. On top of that, more toughness, good. The most important skill or node on the right side here at the beginning is this 50% toughness damage reduction on a critical hit. With the frequency that we're going to actually be applying critical hits, this is fantastic and will basically always be up in a fight. And now on the left side. So the first one is a plus 5% damage boost when you hit an enemy on your next attack, stacking 5 times. Basically what this means is if you swing your sword or your eviscerate or whatever you have and you hit 2 enemies, this means your next attack will have plus 10% damage. It will then consume the stack. So whilst this is not particularly good, it basically means you're almost guaranteed to have at least a 5% damage increase on every attack after your first one, given it hits at least 1 enemy, so it's not a bad thing to have. The next one is replenishing 2.5% of your toughness per second. This is a fairly small amount because with the toughness that we're going to be getting from killing enemies, it will far outweigh the 2.5% we'll be getting, but again, not a bad thing to have. Again, toughness, good. This next one basically prevents you from getting absolutely blasted by some of the bigger boys with their big kill hammers, so your maulers and your crushers when they're doing those overhead attacks. It's basically going to stop you from getting one shot in some instances, which is good because living is good, dying bad. Next one, stun storm grenades. These are fantastic because they allow you to clutch pretty hard. So say your teammate has gone down in the middle of a horde. Normally you'd have to kill the enemies or run in there and hope for the best that your blocks can stop them. But with a stun storm grenade, you basically chuck it down, you can run in and save them. On top of that, if there's a massive rager group coming in or a bunch of crushers coming in, you can drop one of these bad boys and they're just sitting there twiddling their thumbs, which is great. 5% melee damage, good, very good. 5% movement speed, good, very good. On the left side here, weak spot and critical hit damage increasing by 50% on a successful dodge. This is good because we're going to be hitting a lot of weak spots and then we're also going to be doing a lot of critical hits. So 50% increased damage, good, good, good. On the right side here, this is a very useful skill because, again, similar to Bleed for the Emperor, it basically means that you're not going to get obliterated by a sneaky crusher who's snuck up behind you with his killy death shoes and smacking you with his big killy death club. So this is a fantastic skill. On top of that, having Holy Revenant basically means that you're going to get put down to 1 HP with Until Death, which means if you lose any of your toughness and you take another hit, whether it's from some random trash mobs, you're going to die, which is not good. With Holy Revenant, this basically allows you to have a bit of a buffer, so even if you go down below 99% toughness, you're not just going to get one shot when the next mob hits you. So a good combo of skills and a very good survivability combination. Next we have Benediction, more toughness damage reduction for not just you, but also your friends, so thumbs up. More toughness, good. And now Fury of the Faithful. Fury of the Faithful is a very interesting activatable, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on in the video. but I'm sure you know how this works. You press a button, you charge in, you get toughness, you get increased damage, you get increased attack speed. Love it. You obviously want to get the increased charges because 2 times the fun. Thumbs up. Moving down, 25% suppression dealt, basically useless, but it's a necessary evil to progress down the tree. Again, toughness, damage reduction, good. Increase attack speed, good, because if we're attacking more often, we're killing more often, and then if we're killing more often, the things that we killed are not killing us. Good. Moving on again, plus 5% melee damage, good. And then sustained assault. So basically, the longer we're in combat, the more we're attacking enemies, the more melee damage we have. So that's fantastic. 20% more melee damage, good. And then moving down the left side here. So this one here, basically increasing impact strength. It's not particularly useful. Impact strength basically relates to staggering enemies, which we're going to be critting and killing them, so it's kind of irrelevant. Additionally, gaining uninterruptible, it's not particularly useful because for the most part we're going to be using light melee attacks. For some of the big boys we're going to be using heavy attacks, but more often than not we're just going to be light. 5% move speed again, great. And this particular ability is very useful. So you've got Fury of the Faithful, which has a 30-second cooldown, which it's not bad, but it's not good. With Invocation of Death, every single time we get a critical hit, this is reducing the cooldown of Fury of the Faithful by 1.5 seconds. With the frequency that we're attacking and the frequency of how many critical hits we're going to be getting, you're basically always going to have a Fury of the Faithful on charge when you're in the middle of a horde, cutting them down. So, very good. And the main aspect of how this critical build works is Blazing Piety. So, by default, the Zealot has a 5% critical chance on the vast majority of the weapons that they have. I'll talk a little bit more about some weapons that don't have a 5% critical chance, but yeah, you have a 5% critical chance by base standards. With Blazing Piety, this adds 15% to your critical hit chance for 8 seconds when you're in Fury. And as you can see, Fury is triggered when 25 enemies have died within 25 meters. This isn't you just killing 25 enemies, this is just 25 enemies, period. So if your friends are cutting down enemies as well, this adds to this, which is good. And we're going off on the right side here. So on top of that, critical hits are also counting towards triggering Fury. So if you crit and then you kill that enemy, that's 2 stacks for Blazing Piety, which is fantastic. And then finally, you're getting a plus 10% critical hit chance. So that basically means you're getting 25% critical hit chance total, plus your 5% equals 30%, which is very, very good. Now, an important thing to note here is you basically get this for 8 seconds after you get 25 enemy kills or critical hits combined, but when it's activated, every single time you or one of your allies in Coherency crit or kill an enemy, it refreshes the cooldown. So you basically have this up for an entire fight, and even beyond the fight. You just gotta shoot an enemy that's just some ambient enemy chilling in the distance, and this will reset. So you can have it up for a massive percentage of the game. Now that basically does it for my recommendations for the talent tree, where if you follow this, the main focus is obviously on pumping out as many crits as possible, as well as bumping up that base damage, as well as having some survivability in there as well. Now, you may have thought some of my choices were a little bit off, and if you want to pick different notes to put your points into, then that is absolutely fine. The most important thing is that you are killing heretics for the Emperor. Now, with the talent tree out of the way, let's take a look at the weapons and the curios. Now, as you can see, for a melee weapon, I'm opted for a Mark 9 heavy sword, and for a ranged weapon, I'm opted for a las pistol. Now, I'll explain a bit more detail why I've chosen each of these, but depending on your playstyle, depending on the attack cycles that you like, or even just the general aesthetic of a weapon, you might decide that you don't want to use either of these and then opt for your own one. So what I'll do is I'll talk about why I've chosen each of these, and then I'll go into a little more detail about potential alternatives and why some weapons may not be as suitable for this sort of build compared to these ones. So firstly, the heavy sword. So the heavy sword is fantastic for a number of reasons. Firstly, the heavy sword attacks pretty fast. This means we have a higher frequency of attacks, which means we have a higher frequency of critical hits, which means we have a higher likelihood of more dead enemies and less dead us, which is great. Secondly, the attack cycles are also quite good. For the light attack, it is a lot of multi-target attacks, which means if there's a big horde in front of you, you can light attack, light attack, light attack, light attack, and they'll all be dead. Additionally, the heavy attack is largely single target. So when you have those rages coming at you, or some of the other big boys, or flak armored enemies like the gunners, you can power one of those bad boys up and usually 1 or 2 hit them, which is also fantastic. In terms of what you should actually be going for on a heavy sword, for modifiers, defenses is the dump stat, so basically you want everything else high numbers. If defenses is low, it's not too bad. For perks, you 100% want to have damage increases versus maniacs, because rages and dreg rages are going to be the bane of your existence, charging at you with their very killy weapons. Additionally, you might want to have damage increase to flak armored enemies or carapace armored enemies. And then for blessings, I've gone for Head Taker, which obviously gives a 7.5% power for 3.5 seconds on hit. Power basically equals damage, cleave, and stagger. So you get each one of those increased by 7.5% per hit. Level 4 of the blessing is 8%, so ideally you want level 4, but if you get level 3, that's also okay. And then also Death Blow. So you'll get plus 12.5% weak spot damage. Now, weak spots are people's heads because that's where their brains are, and brains are important for staying alive. Hence, weak spot, kill the brain, dead person, right? But importantly here, weak spot kills ignore enemy hit mass. Now, what does that mean? So, when you swing your weapon, you will have a certain amount of enemy that you can get through before the attack stops dealing damage. If you're ignoring enemy hit mass when you kill someone, that basically means that their hit mass doesn't count, and then you can use that hit mass on the next enemy, and the next enemy, and the next enemy. So you hit someone in the head, you'll do increased damage. If you're also critting, there's a high likelihood that they will die, and then you'll be able to do it to the next person and the next person and so on. So weak spot kills ignoring enemy hit mass is very useful. Now, I've had the most success with Head Taker and Death Blow, but the heavy sword also has other really good blessings such as Rampage and Savage Sweep. So if Head Taker and Death Blow don't work for you, then by all means feel free to pick and choose. Now, an honourable second place I feel has to go to the Eviscerator, as it shares a number of the same qualities that make the heavy sword great. Like the heavy sword, most of the light attacks for the Eviscerator are multi-target. However, it does include a single target light attack, which reduces the effectiveness on larger hordes. Additionally, a charged heavy attack and the special attack allow you to lock some of the bigger targets in place, like rages and crushers. This can basically stop a crusher mid-kill move, which is great. The only issue with locking that target in place is you are also locked in place. So if there's a blob of rages or a blob of crushers, you are now in a spot of bother. Now, just like the heavy sword, you want to have a damage bonus versus maniacs, and then again, you can either have flak, your carapace, crit hit chance, whatever works for you. And then for blessings, fairly similar. Rampage and Savage Sweep are my personal favorites for the Eviscerator. But apart from those two perks, the Eviscerator doesn't really have too much else going for it. Shred, which increases your critical hit chance, is always a good thing. And then as well as that, Wrath, potentially as an alternative to Savage Sweep. Now, in terms of other weapons you could use, I wouldn't necessarily recommend anything else. For example, all the combat and tactical axes are largely single target focused, so you'll struggle a little bit more with hordes and not being able to apply as many critical hits as you otherwise would. You have things like the Crusher, the Thunderhammer, which are a little bit slower, and I feel benefit more from something like a momentum build, but I'd recommend the Mark 9 Heavy Sword, followed by the Eviscerator. But obviously your mileage may vary, you might rather use a different weapon. Now for ranged weapons, the las pistol. Now you might be asking yourself, why is this guy recommending that I use a las pistol? It looks silly and dinky. And I asked myself the same question, but let me tell you why I am recommending it. Firstly, I mentioned at the start that the Zealot has a 5% modifier of critical hit chance modifier on the majority of its weapons. The las pistol has a 15% crit chance by default. Now that is pretty good. On top of that, it has a truly incredible damage multiplier for actually hitting crits. And if my memory serves correctly, 25% from Blazing Piety plus 15% from the las pistol equals lots of crits, which means lots of baddies are dying, which means those baddies aren't killing me, and I'm happy. So when you're actually building a las pistol, there's a couple things worth keeping in mind. For modifiers, your dump stats are mobility, and then followed second by stability. The important ones are damage and stopping power, and then ammo. For perks, you generally want to go for your unyielding enemies, flak armored enemies, maniacs, damage multipliers. You might want to go for critical hit chance depending, but obviously for this one I've got unyielding and flak armored enemies. And then for your blessings, I've gone for Dum Dum, which is great because the more close range hits you get, the increased damage you get, and more damage equals more dead enemies, good. And then Infernus, because again, mine goes back to the whole idea of the build of doing crits, and if we're doing crits, we're stacking burns on them, and burning heretics is very good. An honorable mention is the revolver. Now, like the las pistol, the revolver has a fairly high critical hit chance. This is because of the critical bonus modifier, where when you're up in that 79-80 range, you're looking at about 20-21% critical hit chance, which when you combine with Blazing Piety, you're looking at 45-ish, 50% critical hit chance, which is obviously fantastic. On top of that, the revolver has a really good damage multiplier for critical hits, and you combine that with a blessing such as hand cannon. You're shooting a crusher, and it's ignoring a big chunk of their armor, resulting in lots of damage being done. So for modifiers, similar to the las pistol, mobility is the dump stat. You want high damage, penetration, critical bonus, and ideally reload speed. But mobility is one you don't really care so much about. In terms of perks, again, damage increases to unyielding, flak armored, carapace armored, critical hit chance, maniacs. And in terms of blessings, good blessings are obviously hand cannon is fantastic, and surgical is quite good as well. Without surgical, you have about a 50% base critical hit chance when Blazing Pity's up, which is pretty good. If you have surgical, you can aim a little bit longer and get a guaranteed crit, but it's not absolutely necessary. I think the base critical hit chance is pretty good, and I don't think it's as good as a las pistol, but it's an honorable mention. And then you get to Curios. Now, what I'd recommend you run in almost every instance is 1 toughness and then 2 health Curios. Now you might be thinking, why wouldn't I just run 3 toughness Curios? And let me tell you, say a bomber or a flamer rocks up and unloads all over you. Fire on reject equals 0 toughness, and then you're straight down to your health, and that can very quickly go astray if there's trash on you or whatever there might be. So to combat that, having the health Curios helps to offset that to a degree, where with these 2 Curios, I've got plus 41% health, which makes a pretty significant difference. In terms of the perks that you want on the Curios, I'd highly recommend getting damage resistant to gunners, because gunners suck. On top of that, I'd recommend getting the 5% on all 3, and then the 3rd perk is kind of up to whatever you want. For mine, I've gone for or for 2 of them, I've gone for plus 30% toughness regeneration. And for this one, I just have damage resistance to snipers because I ran out of perks that I could swap out. But the third one is just kind of up to whatever you'd like it to be, whether that's toughness regeneration speed or whatever. I probably wouldn't recommend going for combat regen because you'll be regenning it so quickly through your critical hits anyway. That's basically your Curios. So how are you dealing with various enemies? So you've got your trash mobs that you're going to be cutting apart with your heavy sword. With the light attacks, you're going to have your rages who are going to be charging at you, and then you can alternate between using a heavy sword and your las pistol for them, depending. I'd recommend using a charge of Fury the Faithful and heavy attacking them in the head. That will usually 1 or 2 shot them, which is always good because that means they're not going to kill you. Additionally, the las pistol is largely for taking out your various elites and specials. So there's gunners hiding at the back that you can't get to because you'll get staggered and suppressed, and you'll just be very slowly getting pushed backwards and you'll cry. So you can use the las pistol for dealing with gunners, for various elites, so your snipers, bombers, flamers, whatever. But then you come to your maulers and your crushers, and that's what the las pistol's for. And you might be thinking, Moonpipe, what are you talking about? I've shot a las pistol at a crusher before. It does no damage at all. And yeah, correct, but that's where Fury of the Faithful comes in. Fury of the Faithful, melee ability, right? Yeah, but it's also a ranged ability, where when you pop it, you obviously get your 50% toughness, you gain 20% attack speed, which applies for melee and for ranged. And then obviously the melee hit gains 25% increased damage and it's a guaranteed critical hit. But what it doesn't actually tell you on the ability rundown is that it has 2 different effects. So for melee, yep, you've got you gain 25% guaranteed critical hit. But for ranged, for 3 seconds after you activate the ability, it'll basically lower the armor quality of the target that you're shooting at. So for example, if you're shooting at a carapace armored crusher, it will lower the armor to flak for 3 seconds, meaning if you're unloading 100 million shots in him with your 20% increased attack speed and your 40% crit chance, you'll be doing lots of crits. And if you look at the critical modifier for flak armored enemies with a las pistol, you're dealing a lot of damage. And on top of that, if you're hitting a weak spot, which is quite easy to do because Ogryns have quite large heads, you're going to be doing a whole lot of damage. So if you're using a las pistol in that 3 seconds of activating Fury of the Faithful, you'll be taking down an Ogryn easy. Now, this benefit of Fury of the Faithful obviously applies to any ranged weapon that you use, but based on the inherent increased critical hit chance of the las pistol, on top of the critical hit damage multiplier that it has, is the main reason that I actually recommend using it. Now, the honorable mention, the revolver also works well with this, but you unload all 5 bullets in less than 3 seconds, so you're not able to maximize the damage that you're actually able to get from this. But that basically does it. We've had a look at the talent tree as well as my various weapon recommendations, as well as the combination between the las pistol and the Fury of the Faithful. I did want to include some gameplay of an Auric Damnation or Maelstrom run through, but as the video is already 20 minutes long, I thought that would likely be pushing it. But rest assured, you're going to easily be able to complete those difficulty levels given you have a good foundational game sense. If you'd like to see me play some Darktide, feel free to come and check me out on Twitch. My Twitch channel is in the description, but whatever the case, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day/night. Until next time, bye.